Hi everyone, welcome back. In this week's video, I'm sharing my sketchbook I kept through my travels in Portugal this summer, and I'm stepping out 3 of the artworks for you. I selected these because you don't need any art experience, and I want to get you started using a sketchbook with this easy mixed media art process. There are infinite possibilities when it comes to starting a sketchbook. I love using patterned fabric in mine because it has built into it the elements of art like color, value, or another way to say that is contrast, and texture. You only need the smallest pieces, which makes it very affordable, and it's even easier to reposition than paper. Now, paper is amazing because you can recycle your favorite magazines after you've enjoyed them. The reason I love collage and mixed media is because it can be purely experimental with no pressure. It's about discovery and honoring your choices along the way. It puts our expectations on hold while we make moment-to-moment choices based on what brings us joy. And it's a great way to get in touch with our childlike spirit. In a couple of weeks, I'll share a more painterly approach from my sketchbook where I use a limited palette and some pens, so stay tuned for that. If you like my videos, I'd appreciate a thumbs up. Thank you. And for more art-inspired content every week, please be sure to subscribe. Now, let's dive in. Mod Podge is perfect for a sketchbook. It's affordable and it protects layers as you build them up with different mixed media techniques, and you can paint on it. I'll talk more about fabrics in Project 1. I prefer affordable brushes that have a flat edge, small round brushes for detail work. For even more savings, you can use an inexpensive foam brush. Acrylic paints come in a variety of prices and qualities. I love them because you can layer them easily and you can dilute them with water to make them more transparent. Acrylic paint also comes in a pen. I love Posca pens. I recommend starting with at least a white and a black in 0.7 millimeters. For travel, I used a moleskin sketchbook with watercolor paper because it can take a lot of layers and water. So I actually used a lot of magazines and fabric, and you can see that it handled it pretty well. I also have used inexpensive sketchbooks, and these are fine, if you want to just use glue stick, and you can also make your own sketchbook. I use 300-pound watercolor paper to create this sketchbook, and what I love about it is that it's a little bit bigger size and it really can handle a lot of layers. I like to use opaque fabrics when I'm using matte Mod Podge. If I were to use a shiny fabric, then the shininess would go away with the matte Mod Podge. I always like to select fabrics that have a pattern or a flower or something interesting about them, maybe a texture, because just a plain colored cotton fabric isn't going to do much on the page. So here you can see I have a variety of flowers. These fabrics are not 100% cotton because I bought them in Portugal and I had to be flexible. However, I do recommend 100% quilter's cotton. These have a little polyester in them. And also I love to keep my loose threads, so I actually cut and tear fabric a little sloppily on purpose because I love having loose threads. I think it adds to the charm of the artwork. And these fabrics that I selected are purely based on what my heart desired. So I went to the fabric store, I saw a pile of scrap fabrics, and I thought, oh wow, I love these colors. I love the movement in that pink one with the bubbles, and I just loved the contrast of the pink flowers with the black background. And then this very vibrant yellow with these little flowers. So when you're selecting fabrics, please purchase or find ones that just speak to you, speak to your childlike heart. So here you can see that I've applied Mod Podge to the bottom of the fabric, and also now I'm applying it on top of the fabric. And I'm using my fingers and brush to smooth out any air bubbles. And I'm going to move slowly for this next fabric as well so you can see the application. You can see that I cover pretty well, pretty generously. and then I lay the fabric on top. And I'm not really worried about the placement because this particular piece is just really about being spontaneous wherever I want the fabric to be. In fact, I will layer the light pink one on top of this one. But you can see that I even move the threads in the direction that I want them to go, and all that is just preference as well. Now I'll let this dry completely before I go ahead and use the paints. Now the paints that I have selected are from the brand Golden, but really any craft paint will work with this process. In fact, in future videos I will do craft paint only projects for you to see as well. But this is what I had taken with me on my trip. So here I am applying a little burnt umber and cadmium yellow light, and I absolutely love this combination, and you only just need a little bit of the brown. And I'm going to use the other end of my brush to write and scratch out a word. And you can do scribbles, or you can do shapes, and you can do flower shapes, whatever you'd like. Here you can see that I'm also using a piece of computer paper to press and lift up some of that extra paint, and then I move that blob, that initial blob, over to another part of my paper so that I can press down just some paint. So here I'm just picking colors that I love, and I'm making blobs on the paper and moving that around with the computer paper. So you can see that the colors start to blend together. That little bit of orange on top of that initial yellow-brown combination on the left, you know, just creates a cool like interference effect. And now I'm leaving a little white space as well, you know, just a little bit. And I'm now using my finger to, you know, blend in, and the brush. So I don't want to blend too much, because what starts to happen when you blend some colors together is you start to get a muddy look. Now this is where a little magic takes place. Right now I'm just moving the sketchbook around to see if there's something that I can see that I might want to develop in this piece. And you know, what cracked me up is that I immediately saw this funny, you know, faced girl in this artwork, and I just immediately saw her holding a suitcase. And this is what happens when you keep a sketchbook and you make art intuitively like this. It's like looking at clouds in the sky, right? You see the shapes, but you're relying on your imagination to see that. And so that's what's happening here. I also have with me some acrylic gouache paints by Holbein, and I love these because they are very opaque and saturated. And so they're really nice to outline with, especially on top of acrylic paints. You will not get any transparency coming through. And here what I'm doing is I'm outlining what I am thinking are her facial parts, right? Her eyes, her long nose, and I will outline her mouth. And I don't want to overdo it, you know, because one of the bits of magic with this project is that, you know, she happened kind of serendipitously, and, you know, she kind of grew out of my imagination. So I want to keep that first layer really see-through and coming through. I don't want to cover it up with a lot of paint. So I'm just using these paints to make some little details that suggest that, you know, she's a person. And you can see there that she has one little hand on the left. She's going to be holding her suitcase with a much larger hand. There you saw that I also used the black Posca pen. You can use a variety of supplies. I prefer using acrylic-based supplies because I can blend them with water and dilute them, and they will not run if I put more water on top of them once they're dry. So for example, if I were to use watercolor paints and then I blended water on top of them, those watercolor paints would smear. So you don't get that issue, you don't have that issue with the acrylic paints. You can see that her smaller hand is holding a little phone, and that's because she likes to take a lot of videos when she's traveling and photos. And the other part here, unfortunately the video cut off, but she has one longer leg and a small shoe, and then she has a bigger leg on the right. And again, this is all abstract and playful, and it's really whatever I want it to be. And so when you're making your artwork, you know, it is whatever you want it to be, whatever delights you. So the final details, this is really fun just to, again, continue with the playfulness. I like to use a variety of lines. So here I'm using a smaller Posca pens to make little eye shine with the white. You can see that this particular outline around her eye is thicker, but now I'm going to use a thinner black Posca line in just a moment to outline her other eye. And it's nice to get a variety of thicknesses of your line work, and you can see now I'm also adding a variety of patterns, and you know, it's all very subtle, but it just keeps the eye moving around. There you can see that I'm finally going to add the black thin line, and that just adds more contrast to the piece and it keeps the eye moving around the artwork. It was super fun to discover this bit of creativity that helped me feel what I love, which is I love to travel and I love to make art. In this project, I'd like to show you how I interpret a scene like this one where you have layers of buildings and a river with a bridge. I love architecture, so this is why I chose this artwork. So drawing something like this can be daunting. So I like to really simplify just some of the fun shapes that I see. I'm going to keep my arches very simple. I'm going to have them get smaller, and that just gives a little perspective to the drawing so that way it doesn't seem as flat. Now, I love flat artwork, so whatever you feel comfortable doing, the arches really indicate that it's a bridge, and once I paint in the water, that will become really obvious. Here, I'm just showing you just how I'm cutting a little more precisely than I did in the last project, and that's because I want my buildings to be as square as possible. And like I told you before, this particular fabric is a little stretchy, so I'm just being a little more careful. I also recommend not looking at your reference photo. I like to work from memory, so that way the shapes are just very simple. I only have, you know, maybe 3 buildings that are not perfectly square. Those 2 that are in the center there that are a little bit bigger and wider, they have just some very simple curves. And now I'm just speeding through the Mod Podge process, which I showed you in project 1, so I'm not going to go into detail about that, and I'm just going to keep moving the project forward and explain the detail work. I'm creating the illusion of layers because I'm putting some buildings on top of the ones that are at the forefront. Here I'm sketching in some very simple shapes, rounded roofs, some triangle shapes to indicate the church and the tower, the circle for the clock, and some basic shapes for tree forms. And the reason I'm doing that is because acrylic paints dry really fast, and so as I'm working with the paints, I don't want to spend a lot of time thinking about, okay, what's next, what's next. I can just sort of relax, you know, I know what I'm doing. And here I'm just creating like a little suggestion of a castle wall. I'm starting with acrylic gouache paints, and I'm using quite a bit of water, and you can see that I am covering up many of the pencil lines, but once it dries I will still be able to see through and see those boats. And plus my brain has now memorized, you know, where these shapes are because I drew them in. And what I love about acrylic gouache paints is, as you can see as I'm doing with these triangle shapes, is that it's very saturated and very opaque. I'm not worrying whether my lines are straight. You can see that with the paintbrush, it's very forgiving. It's just a suggestion of some triangle shapes. And as I outline this building with the blue, you can see now that the leaf that seemed really kind of busy and maybe a little out of place is a little more contained. So I feel like outlining goes a really long way towards helping strengthen a composition. Here, shingles on a roof are just little U shapes that, I'm repeating in various colors of that very deep fuchsia, darker red, and orange. So again, the outlining, and you'll see how as we progress, I'll talk about how I'm using contrast in order to make this artwork stronger. Tree forms, doesn't have to look like a tree. I mean, I just basically did a cloud shape and just filled it in with some marks with the paintbrush. And the castle wall, this is just like a crisscross shape to suggest, masonry work, bricks. I'm using, color to emphasize. So on that pink fabric, I'm staying with sort of the pink theme by using the strong pink, the fuchsia. So using acrylic gouache on top of the fabrics is great because it does paint very opaque. With acrylic paint, like if I were to use a white, it might require 2 or 3 coats just to get it as opaque as this acrylic gouache is. What I'm noticing right now with the building on the far left with the flowers is that it's difficult. The flowers are competing with the whites. So as soon as this all dries, I think what I'm going to do is push back the fabric, and I'll do that with some watered down white. And I'm explaining it to you now, so when it happens quickly on the video, you understand what I'm doing. I'm making sure that when I'm using the Posca pens, like right now for the details, that if I add it to any paint, I make sure that that paint is totally dry. And just as in Project 1, that black Posca pen goes a long way towards making details really pronounced. So here I can do some line work that really suggests an ornate door without knowing what those details are. A few scribbles inside a rectangle, some circles, a little more outlining. That is all you need to create the illusion that this is a church. As you progress with mixed media, I feel like it's really important just to mention that it's all based on how you feel and what your intuition is telling you. I felt like I couldn't see the bridge as much anymore when the buildings became more, busy and more detailed. I needed to do something to emphasize the bridge a little bit. So that's why I did just some very subtle black lines in the arches, and then I did that stronger black line on the top of the bridge to differentiate it from the buildings. To outline those green triangles on that tower that I'm working on right now, I left a little bit of white space, and that again gives the illusion of some kind of, side to that tower. The windows that I'm, highlighting, they don't all have to be completely outlined. You just need to put a little bit of color or white just to have them pop a little bit more. The castle wall, I waited until the line work was totally dry before I put in some watered down green, that lighter green. With the sky, I'm using the acrylic gouache and I'm watering it down, and I'm not worried that there is pink on my brush. I kind of like that, and it helps keep the painting cohesive. There's that color that's in the actual buildings, that pink that I used, and it's kind of bleeding into the sky, and that just makes the whole thing a little more cohesive. So now I'm painting in that building that I mentioned earlier, and I'm pushing back the color, the flower pattern. You can still see it coming through, but just a little bit of watered down white now helps the building pop a little bit more. And now the doors and that little bit of fabric on the bottom edge of it, gives it a little more pop. I'm jumping ahead a little bit because I just want to mention that when I'm doing people in this kind of collage medium and in a landscape like this, I'm keeping it really simple. There won't be any facial features. It'll just be a suggestion of a person in a boat. As I zoom in on this piece, I just want to point out that my shapes are not perfect. The triangles are wonky, so are my rectangles. There are no perfect corners. And that is what I love about this process, is there's a real freedom to it. that you don't need to have things be precise. It's the combination of the pens and the fabric and the paint that really brings this all to life. Another way to creatively express our impressions about a place or an object or even a feeling is with paper. And you can make photocopies of your photos, or you can use magazines and words to add to your mixed media art. So here's an artwork that uses very basic shapes to create a landscape. And the thing that I'd like you to think about the most is using fabrics that have different values. For example, all of these fabrics that I'm placing are green, but they have different shades of green, right? This triangle piece is much darker than all the rest, and that creates contrast. As you're working with paper, magazine especially, it dries quickly and adheres to the layers beneath it, so it doesn't reposition as easily as fabric does. Since I'm using very simple shapes as I did in Project 2, I'm going to jump ahead and show you how I created some of the paper houses in the bottom left-hand corner. I like to find clippings that have something going on, even if it's just a tiny little thing that suggests that we're inside of a house. And in this case, I'm just cutting out a little house shape. I'm using that little lamp and the flowers as my suggestion as to what's inside the house. And then I loved that it just happened that I found that little word at the very top in this particular clipping. And then I used the Posca pens to give it more details. You'll notice here that I'm using fabric pieces for the sky, so you don't have to necessarily only use the paints, to do large areas. I like the mosaic look, that layering some of these fabric squares and different values of blue to create a little more dimension and texture, and then incorporating the words inside of those shapes also just makes the piece more interesting and more personal. As in the other projects, I'm adding details with the Posca pen markers. And final note, I just want to emphasize how important it is that you are relaxed and you're enjoying yourself as you're creating art. This is supposed to be a time for you. Make it your own and, listen to wonderful music, have a nice cup of tea or your favorite beverage as you're creating. Make it as wonderful and lovely as you possibly can, because you absolutely deserve fun, creative time. Thanks, everyone.